Assalamualaikum and hello everybody. Welcome back to my channel. Today I would like to discuss about accounting for bad debts using allowance methods and the percentage of receivable. Now we must know what is the definition of account receivable. Account receivable refers to money owed by customers in exchange for goods or services that have been delivered or used but not paid yet. Account receivable is collected within a credit term. The credit term indicates when payment is due for sales made on credit. It is normally in terms of 30 or 60 days. Example, transaction that involve account receivable. Sold goods on credit RM2000 to John with credit terms 2/10 and /30 on 1st July 2020. Referring to the example above, John is a debtor starting from the date of sales on credit is made. Under allowance method, the company estimates bad debt expenses at the end of the accounting period and then record as an adjusting entry. There are two bases of estimating under uncollectible accounts. Number one, percentage of receivables, and number two, percentage of sales. The offset to the expense is a contra account that we call allowance for doubtful debts. The allowance for doubtful debt account reduces account receivable. Now we focus on allowance method using percentage of receivable. Firstly, you must calculate the balance carry forward of allowance for doubtful debts. This is the formula. Percentage of allowance times closing balance of account receivable, then you will get closing balance for allowance for doubtful debts. There are a few steps to calculate bad debts under percentage of receivable. Number one, you have to calculate balance carry forward account receivable. So if you want to calculate the carry forward of account receivable, we must open account receivable to record all the transactions that relate to account receivable. The step number two, calculate balance carry forward allowance for doubtful debts. So this is the formula, percentage time balance carry forward of account receivable, then you will get carry forward allowance for doubtful debts. And the third step, you have to calculate bad debts expenses. When you want to calculate bad debt expenses, we have to open account for AFDD or allowance for doubtful debts. You have to record all the transactions related to allowance for doubtful debt and the missing figure in the allowance for doubtful debts represent for bad debts expenses. And at the end of accounting period, we have to make an adjustment for bad debt expenses. Now we look at example number one. Calculate bad debt expenses or increase in allowance for doubtful debts. So, David Enterprise report in the financial position statement as at 31st December 2018. So, the account receivables balance 100,000 and allowance for doubtful debt 4,000. So, there are transactions that relate to account receivable that occurred for the year 2019. September 20 credit sales. So that means debit account receivable and credit sales with the amount 26,000. October 20 received from account receivable or received from customer. So debit cash credit account receivable. And 30th of November, write off account receivable. So we must use the allowance method because allowance for doubtful debt had the balance from previous year. Now we have to debit allowance for doubtful debts 500 and credit account receivable. And it is given that the company estimate uncollectible debts is 5% of account receivable. So you have to calculate bad debt expenses, but before that you must record all the transactions in the general journal and prepare adjusted journal entry of bad debt expenses. So this is the journal entry for all the transaction that occurred during 2019. The first one, debit account receivable and credit sale. This is credit on sales. The second one, we receive cash from customer, debit cash and credit account receivable. And the third one, to write off account receivable using allowance method, debit allowance for doubtful debt 500 and credit account receivable. Now, this is the first step when you want to calculate bad debt. You have to record all the transactions that incurred relate to account receivable. So, the first one you have to record the balance brought forward for account receivable, and we have to record all the transactions. We start with September 20th of September, credit sales. So debit account receivable 26,000. And after that, we receive cash from account receivable. So credit account receivable with the amount 23,000. And the 30th November, write off bad debt or write off account receivable, and we must use allowance for doubtful debt method, debit AFDD and credit account receivable. After that, you must balance the account, the debit side with 126,000, compare with the credit side with 126,000. So this is the balance carry forward for account receivable. So step number 2, we have to calculate the balance of allowance for doubtful debt. This is the balance carried forward. So the formula is 5% allowance times the balance of account receivable 102,500, and you will get the balance carried forward for AFDD is 5,125. So now we have to prepare the allowance for doubtful debt because we want to calculate bad debt expenses. First, we must record all the transactions that incurred that relate to allowance for doubtful debts. So there are 2 transactions. No, only one. So first, you must write down the balance for doubtful debt 4,000 we get from the question. And this one, write off bad debt or write off account receivable. So the double entry, debit allowance for doubtful debt and credit account receivable. And we have calculated the amount for balance carried forward for allowance for doubtful debt. The amount is 5,125. And after that, you must close allowance for doubtful debt. Then when you want to balance the amount debit side 5,625 and the credit side 5,625, and you get the missing figure. This is what we call bad debt expenses. After you calculate bad debt expenses, you must record in the adjusted journal entry. Debit bad debt expenses 1,625 and credit allowance for doubtful debts 1,625. So this is the first example how to record bad debt expenses in the adjusted journal entry. So you can see that from allowance for doubtful debt, the balance from previous year or from 2018 is only 4,000, but the balance for current year or the end of 2019, the allowance for doubtful debt increased with the amount 5,125. So we have to make an adjustment. This one we call bad debt expenses or increase in allowance for doubtful debt. And we must record the expenses in the statement income. And for allowance for doubtful debt, you must record in the financial position, must contra with account receivable. Now we go to the question number 2 or exercise 2. Calculate decrease in allowance for doubtful debts. So you are given the same statement from David Enterprise. You are given the balance for account receivable, the balance for allowance for doubtful debts. And this is the transaction incurred during the year 2019. So we have to prepare the journal entry as usual. This one, credit sales, debit account, receivable and credit sale. And the 20th of October, debit cash, credit account receivable, and 30th of November, write-off account receivable. We must use allowance method because we have the balance from previous year. Now, debit, allowance for doubtful debts, and credit account receivable. And the company estimate uncollectible debt is 5% of account receivable. So, first step. Okay, now you are required to prepare the general journal, and you have to prepare adjusted journal entry of bad debt expenses. Now, the first step. This one you have to prepare the journal entry, debit account receivable, credit sale for the transaction of 20th September, and for receive cash from customer on 20th October, debit cash, credit account receivable, and 30th of November, allowance for doubtful debt debit 500 and credit account receivable 500 to record write-off account receivable. And now the first step, when you want to apply using percentage of account receivable, we have to calculate the balance carried forward of account receivable. So we have to open account receivable and we have to add all the transactions that relate to account receivable. So this is the balance from the financial position from previous year, and this is September 20 sales on credit. So debit account receivable 26,000. After that, receive cash from account receivable, debit cash, and credit account receivable. And 30th of November, write off account receivable using allowance method. So debit allowance method. Debit allowance for doubtful debt and credit account receivable. So you have to balance the debit side, the total amount of debit side, and the total amount of credit side with the same amount. So this is the balance carried forward of account receivable 102,500. Now the second step that you have to calculate the balance carried forward of allowance for doubtful debt. So this is the formula. 5% of allowance given in the question times the balance carried forward of account receivable 102,500. Then you will get 5,125. This one is the balance or the balance carried forward of allowance for doubtful debt, or this one is the ending balance of allowance for doubtful debt. The second step, you have to record all the transactions that relate to allowance for doubtful debt. We have to open allowance for doubtful debt because we want to calculate the adjustment or the missing figure from the account. So the first one given from the question, the balance from previous year is 6,000 for allowance for doubtful debt, and November 30th account receivable 500. This is the transaction where we have to write off account receivable. So debit allowance for doubtful debt and credit account receivable are the amount of 500. And we have calculated just now using the formula percentage of balance account receivable, and you got the amount 5,125. This one we must use the balance of account receivable, and you must close the allowance for doubtful debt by balancing the debit side 6,000 with the credit side 6,000. So this is the missing figure. This figure we call decrease in allowance for doubtful debt. Why we call decrease in allowance for doubtful debt? Okay, from previous year or from last year 2018, the balance for allowance for doubtful debt is 6,000. But the current year, the balance of allowance for doubtful debt is only 5,125. This one we have to record in the the statement of income. That one we call decrease in allowance for doubtful debt, and we must record in other income in the statement of income, because the allowance for doubtful debt from last year 6,000 compared to this year or the current year 5,125. That means it will increase the net profit of 2019 in the statement of income. So when we record in adjusted journal entry, debit allowance for doubtful debts and credit decrease in allowance for doubtful debt. Why we decrease in allowance for doubtful debt? Because this is revenue or other revenue or other income. So this is the example. We show that the balance of allowance for doubtful debt decreased compare from last year compare with this year. That's all for today. Don't forget to watch next video accounting for bad debts allowance method using percentage of credit sales. Don't forget to subscribe, like and share. Thank you.